The 10th and last process of the build, acquire and implement domain, called manage configuration, has 5 practices. The second practice is to establish a configuration repository and baseline. The entities responsible for this practice are the head of IT development, the head of IT administration, and the IT service manager. The entity that is held accountable is the head of IT operations. The practice receives one input, which is the register of software licenses from the BAI10 process. It generates 2 outputs, which are the configuration repository to be used by the BAI9 and DSS2 processes, and the configuration baseline to be used by the BAI3 process. The activities involved in this practice include identifying and classifying the configuration items. These items should then be used to populate the configuration repository. The configuration baselines of the applications and services should be established and agreed on. The third practice is to maintain the configuration items. The entities responsible for this practice are the head of IT development, the head of IT operations, and the head of IT administration. The entity that is held accountable is the Chief Information Officer. The practice receives 3 inputs, which are the change request status reports from the BAI6 process, the asset register from the BAI9 process, and the asset register revisions from the BAI9 process. It generates 2 outputs, which are the updated repository with configuration items to be used by the DSS2 process, and the approved changes to baseline to be used by the BAI3 process. The activities involved in this practice include identifying the changes to configuration items on a regular basis, and reviewing any proposed changes against the baseline. The configuration details should be updated for the approved changes, and the baseline itself should be approved for changes if needed. The fourth practice is to produce configuration reports. The entity responsible for this practice is the head of IT administration, and the entity that is held accountable is the head of IT operations. The practice receives one input, which is the results of physical inventory checks from the BAI9 process. It generates one output, which is the configuration status reports to be used by the BAI3 and DSS2 processes. The activities involved in this practice include identifying the status changes of the configuration items. The configuration changes should match the approved requests for change, and any unauthorized changes should be reported to the change management. The stakeholder reporting requirements should be identified, including the required content and frequency of reporting. The fifth and last practice is to review the integrity of the configuration repository. The entities that are responsible for this practice include the audit function, the head IT architect, and the IT service manager. The entity that is held accountable is the head of IT operations. The practice receives no inputs, but generates 3 outputs, which are the results of configuration items verifications to be used internally, the license deviations to be used by the MEA3 process, and the results of repository completeness reviews to be used internally. The activities involved in this practice include periodically verifying the configuration items against the configuration repository. Automated discovery tools could be utilized to facilitate the checks. All deviations from the approved changes should be reported and reviewed. The physical configuration items should be physically verified that they still exist. The completeness of the configuration repository and its accuracy should be periodically compared to the set targets, and actions should be taken if needed. Other sources that provide further insights into this process include the ISO 20000 standard, and the ITIL framework.